Hello, we are so excited today for our special book and author highlight, spotlight, stand up, celebrate. We have been blessed to catch Vanessa Priya Daniel on their current book tour, author of Unrig the Game, What Women of Color Can Teach Everyone About Winning. Vanessa, I am so happy that you would take a moment out of your busy tour to say hello to us. How are
Thank
you?
you so much, Lindsay. I'm wonderful, and it's really good to be here with you. Thanks for having me on.
I don't know about you, but despite writing a book and being out in the world at this time, are you at all tired like I am?
Yeah, I think that there's a bone tired that a
Mm,
lot of us feel just with everything that we've been living through in this country for the last several years, really since 2016. And so I feel that, but I'm also a mom of two daughters. And so I also feel the urgency of the moment and that there's no choice but to get up and to fight and, bring our hearts to making the world a better place. So um, this process of putting the book together actually gave me a lot of energy to do
yeah.
that and help me with some of the feelings of exhaustion that I had going into it.
Mm, bone tired, she said. Tell us a little bit about this. Unrig the Game really delves into different strategies, different historic ways that we have been going about revolution
Hmm.
and points to the pattern or the trend or the opportunity in really letting Black women and women of color lead this movement at this time. Why is that important?
Yeah, well, this book is something that I wrote because I want us and I want our movements to win. And I
Oh,
am very clear that there's no team that's serious about winning that benches its MVPs for no good reason, particularly in the clutch moment of a big game. And we are in the fight of our lives right now against fascism. We need our full strength. So much of that strength comes from our best leaders in movement, and many, many of those leaders are women of color. We know that throughout the history of the United States, women of color and Black women in particular have always led in our movements, have been the backbone of our movements. And yet we have never had a serious conversation in the public square about how much more we could all be winning if we really valued the strategic brilliance they're bringing and if we stopped making leadership positions so treacherous for them. So this book is attempting to crack open that conversation. I interviewed over 45 incredible leaders across
mm,
different movements to be able to do that. And um, I think that there's some amazing hope that I found in the process that I am trying to also pass through to readers about this embarrassment of riches that we have in leadership if we would only support and tap into it.
wow, wow. I'm reminded, I don't know, this is aging myself, but Cedric the Entertainer, back
Hmm.
in the day, he makes this joke about Rosa Parks isn't a leader. All she did was sit her ass down on the bus. What do you
Mm.
say to the people who look back and go, how could Black women be our MVP? Don't we need white men, white women to be leading this moment?
Yeah, well, I think we need to look at our history. And when I talk about women of color and Black women, especially as MVPs of social change, there's a couple things that make people MVPs, but one of them is points that you put on the board for your team.
Ooh,
And we need to be real that so many of the points that progressives or liberals count on our side of the board would not exist if women of color, in particular, Black women, had not put them there. We've got 30 million kids in this country who don't learn hungry because of the Black women who started the Black Panther breakfast program
mm,
and catalyzed free and reduced breakfast and lunch in our nation's public schools. When we look at even how terrible this moment is now, imagine how much worse it would be if we had not had a 4 years to have a breath in between Trump administrations. And that breath was brought to us by Black women in tough states like Georgia as the tip of the arrow, organizing voters. We can
Yeah.
look right now at how Jasmine Crockett is showing up, how leaders are Latifah Simon is showing up, and can see that much of the left flank in our elected positions is held down by women of color with Black women at the tip of the spear. So, as a non-Black woman of color, I'm half Sri Lankan and half white. It I can say, and I've in many conversations that I've also had with other non-Black women of color who work in movement, for many of us, our story is that it was Black feminism that created a framework that felt large enough to shield us from the combination of white supremacy and patriarchy that was coming at us. It was the stories and the histories of Black women like Harriet Tubman that inspired us, many times Black women who brought us into movement. And so there's an embarrassment of riches there of information, learning, and an importance, I think, of recognizing and honoring that leadership.
Wow. Wow. As some people may not know this, who have been following along, but I am in fact a Black woman. And as I listen, there's a part of me that's like, but Vanessa, I just want to tap out. Like,
Yeah,
not my monkey, not my circus. We did our part. 98% of us done told you this wasn't
yeah,
your guy. What do you say to the Black woman who, and I love this in the book where you talk about the ways that even when Black women are consistently fighting for all of us, they experience these common types of pushback to their efforts, being
yeah,
left out there all alone when they are faulted for doing the work,
yeah.
being expected to achieve at a much higher level than everybody else, to be considered on par with their peers. What do you say to the Black woman who's listening, who knows that she has that history, that diaspora within her, but it's just like, y'all done
Yeah.
fucked around and found out?
Yeah, no, that is exactly what happened. Well, I mean, I wouldn't propose to tell any Black woman what to do, first of all, but, I do look to and take guidance from Black women and also just Black feminists. One of my good friends, Malkia Devich Cyril, who, identifies as gender non-binary, but is a staunch feminist, is a Panther Cub. Their mother was a Black Panther, and they've been in the movement their entire life, put up something that really moved me the other day, which was, this meme that's been going around, this picture of the Black women sitting on buildings and everything is burning and drinking tea or drinking coffee.
Yes.
And Malkia's point on this,
Yeah.
as someone who has, grown up in movement since childhood, is that this image is a fascist dream. You know,
Mm,
this image of folks just standing back and allowing what's going to happen, this sort of either obeying in advance or retreating and allowing fascists to be un unencumbered at all, or not resisted in what they're trying to advance, is really a dream for them. And so, I think it's important to acknowledge people's exhaustion. I think it's important to acknowledge people's frustration. When we look at Black women voting 92% against Trump, more so than any other group, and every time that he's run, just the degree of moral and political clarity that they've demonstrated, there's a reasonable amount of frustration with other groups that have not done
yeah.
that. And I think it's important for people to rest and take care of themselves. And at the same time, I think all of us need to look to our movement ancestors and figure out, the way in which we have the capacity with whatever our situation is, the people we're caring for, the health things that we're dealing with, and figure out how we can engage in a way that makes sense for us. Because just stepping back, we know that the people who are going to suffer the worst from the advance of fascism are always women, oppressed racial and ethnic groups, and LGBTQ communities. And
Mm.
every single woman of color in this country is a member of at least two of those groups. And those of us who are queer, which is a lot of us who are working in social justice, are members of all three. And so my sense in talking to folks is that there's very little illusion that the way we get through this is just keeping our heads down and following directions. We are highly motivated to fight. And we have a lot of experience fighting this kind of threat because what fascism essentially is it's the worst of America, that three-headed monster of patriarchy and white supremacy and extractive capitalism on steroids. And so it makes sense that women of color who have been fighting and battling that a version of that same monster for hundreds of years for our very survival in this country, that we have something to teach America about how to fight.
Mm.
So that's, when I look to Jasmine Crockett, when I look to an AOC, when I look to Fatima Goss Graves, another amazing Black woman leader, and her saying things like the National Women's Law Center will never abandon trans women. Um, that's the kind of fight that is I'm tuning myself to in these times.
I was talking to somebody, a client, and just in this ecosystem of the company where it's almost playing out our larger socio-political climate or story. And this is a cis white man,
Hmm.
upper level management,
Hmm.
on track to, maybe be an owner one day. And I was asking him, how are you okay with this status quo that you are existing within? It seems so counter to your stated values.
Yeah.
You see it doing harm to people who are not benefiting from the same set of identities that you have. How are you making peace with this? And he said,
Hmm.
I'm just surviving each
Mm.
day. And it made me wonder if this cis white man,
Mm.
able-bodied, attractive, upper middle class, Judeo-Christian
Less
diaspora.
attractive after saying that, but go ahead.
Exactly. I mean, girl, I wasn't going to date him. Uh, but, if you're just surviving and somebody comes along, like many of the women in your book, who are working to unrig the game because they do not want everybody to just be surviving. What is the challenge that they have to lead in these environments? Are there
What are
unique
the challenges
challenges?
that women of color are facing with that kind of
Yeah,
mentality, you mean?
yeah.
Well, there are a lot of things, there's a long list of things that bench us in leadership. And in the book, I have something that's called the job description that is
Mm,
the long list of what women of color in leadership are expected to do and put up with in these positions. But the top five that came up the most in the interviews that I did and that were the most consistent, because I also have a section in the book called We Are Not a Monolith, which talks about how people bench Black women in somewhat different ways from how they bench Asian women and Latinas. And so we're not all the same, and that's important. But these are the top five that were the most universal. Number one is the invitation onto a glass cliff to lead an organization in crisis.
mm,
Number two is the assumption of incompetence. Number three is the expectation to mother and mammy.
oof.
Number four is being given zero margin for error. And number five is when you're attacked, you're left alone. So
Yes.
I'll just give a couple examples. I won't go through all of them, but um, being invited onto a glass cliff is you're invited into an organization that is where the house is on fire, and you either work your black or brown girl magic or you take the fall for a mess that you inherited. It also, it looks like Kamala Harris being asked to mount a campaign with less time than any other candidate. Um, the assumption of incompetence is the pressure to work four times as hard to be seen as half as credible, and how that weathers our bodies, minds, and spirits. And I talk to so many sisters who, story after story, working years with no vacation, pulling longer hours than other folks. I talked to one sister, Amisha Patel, a brilliant organizer and leader out of Chicago, who worked through chemo and radiation when she was battling cancer because she did not feel like she could slow down. And so, what this does to our health, the expectation to mother and mammy, the single biggest pain point of anything, of any of the issues that I spoke with people about. This is um, the what it feels like to be cast as mean and aggressive for normal levels of assertiveness that would be accepted from any other leader.
Mm,
It
mm,
is being told you're cold or unfeeling anytime you say no. It is the expectation not just that you create a workplace that's fair and sustainable, but that you create a utopia where no one ever feels a trigger or a discomfort. And then the way you are punished, oftentimes in the public square, if you don't deliver on that impossibility. It is being expected to perform vulnerability because people feel fundamentally uncomfortable with the specter of a woman of color standing fully in her power. And so they need you to perform this kind of a vulnerability. I talked to one leader who got excellent reviews from her team on every single point of her leadership, from strategy to fundraising to management. But they said, but she never cries. And this was actually one of the reasons that she left leadership, was people kept clamoring for her to be more vulnerable. She said, I'm doing my job. Why do you need this from me? I do that at home and with my family. I don't do that at work. Not everyone does that at work. What other leader is being expected to do this? What male leader is being expected to do this? So we see these kind of things happen. And what I guess I would say to a cis white man who says, well, he's going to get through this through surviving, is that, a lot of us aren't surviving right now.
mm,
I just came back from Los Angeles doing an event there where I was in conversation with my dear friend and movement sister, Bambi Salcedo, who is um, a trans Latina woman, and many members of her community were there from Los Angeles. And not everyone is surviving. They are mourning the execution style murder of a trans woman from El Salvador by the Los Angeles Police Department that just happened last week.
mm,
Not all of us are surviving. People are being Mahmoud Khalid, who we saw just being deported, the graduate
mm,
student from Columbia, with no justifiable cause and no deep due process, who's now sitting in a detention center in violation of the Constitution. You know, we are not all surviving in this moment. And the measures that this administration are taking, it is such a luxury for a white man to say, well, I'll just survive this. Because you know what? A lot of people are going to lose their lives with these
mm,
cuts to social programs, with the attacks on the environment, with the gutting of that they're trying to do to Social Security and all of this. We know that the people who are the most marginalized are going to feel that pain and are going to lose life. So I think that white men who on the opposite end of the spectrum, when you look at Black women having this stunning level of moral and political clarity and voting down Trump, white men, as we know, led the way every single election in voting for him, um, need to really come back into greater alignment with their humanity. And I think a lot about this story of Roger McAfee, who was a white man, a dairy farmer from Oregon, who, when Angela Davis was incarcerated and there was a campaign for her freedom, there were two people who they had identified that had said they were willing to post bail for her if and when the judge granted bail. One was Aretha Franklin, Queen of
yeah,
Soul,
yeah.
and the other was Roger McAfee, this dairy farmer. And when the judge granted it, I think Aretha Franklin, they couldn't reach her, and Roger McAfee ended up posting bail. And he got a lot of heat for that. He had to pull his kids out of school because they were being bullied. He had to put security on his around his dairy farm. But when they asked him why he did it, he said, well, because I got it that Angela Davis and her community their freedom, it wasn't just about them, it was also about my community and my children and our freedom.
Mm,
And that piece that is part of how white supremacy has robbed white folks of their God-given good sense to understand that we are in a network of interdependence, to understand that our freedom and liberation is wrapped up together,
mm,
is something that people need to get. And as soon as we get that, maybe we'll stop being the last country, the last industrialized country that doesn't have universal health care because rich white men have convinced poor white men that they didn't want Black and brown people to get a handout.
mm.
Meanwhile, you're losing your house. Poor white people are losing their house because they can't pay their medical bills. We are
Yeah,
all in this together. We are
yeah.
all in this together.
Say more about that, because the title, if I'm picking it up and I'm looking at it and go, unrig the game, well, the game works for me.
Mm,
Expand on that. How is it the game broken? How is the game broken for everybody if I think the game has been working for me?
yeah. Well, it's interesting. In this book, I don't do a lot of talking about white people. And I think that was a choice that I made. There's a lot of books about how white people rig the game for us, and I think that's true. And um, but there isn't a lot of space to really talk about the lateral violence that also happens in and amongst our communities and how we understand unrigging the game for each other. Because for many women of color leaders, the people who are most likely to help them unrig the game, and oftentimes who are causing them the most pain when they participate in its rigging are other people of color and other
Mm,
women of color. And so, um, I talk a lot about the importance of how we show up for each other. And, um, I think that broader education that we're going to feel in a minute, because by the way, Trump didn't win by a huge margin. So at some
mhm,
point, the people who voted for him because they thought he was the shake it up candidate who was going to lower the price of eggs are going to see that the emperor has no clothes.
mhm,
And they're going to, as you said, you know, people fucked around and they're going to find out about just how rigged it is for all of us. Because when Social Security goes, that's all of us. Um, it's going to impact some people worse than others, but the there are more white folks that get Social Security just by the nature of the population than anyone else. Um, so I think that we're going to see that, and we're already seeing that in the erosion of our rights and the loss of things like Roe, how it impacts all of us. But I did want to call us in as people of color and women of color and how we show up for each other, because this last piece about abandonment when attacked often comes from within movements. And
mm,
when you hear a story like, for example, what happened to the initial leaders of the Women's March, there were four of them, but only three of them were singled out for attack ads by the NRA that incited people to threaten their lives. And then
mhm,
they were dragged across the internet behind false accusations and rumors. And they kept reaching out to people in movement, particularly to other people of color in movement, to say, stand with us. And people didn't return their calls. They treated them like they were radioactive. They said, we felt like we were being seen as guilty or hysterical or both. And then a year later, the New York Times broke the story that it was Russian bots that had been behind all of that internet trolling as an attempt to cleave the women's movement on racial lines, which, because of the lack of solidarity that they found, um, the Russian bots were quite successful at doing in that
mhm.
period of time. So there is a lot of internalized white supremacy and patriarchy that we have. And I think of the words of the feminist writer Carolyn Jess Cook, who said, "Why were we taught to fear the witches instead of the people who burn them alive?"
Yeah, yes.
And so, how do we deprogram that even out of our own organizations where there may not be many white folks even on staff um, in some contexts, and where it is, our folks who need to lead the way in showing up and unrigging the game.
Yeah. And even the idea that life is lifey enough without feeling that I'm playing a game that I'm trying to win.
Yeah.
That said, you say something so beautiful in the book that I'd like you to expand on. When speaking with women of color, and particularly Black women, the winning wasn't
Mm,
what many people, or at least within the, let's say, the Western paradigm that we think winning is. What is the actual winning
mm,
many women of color and Black women point to?
yeah. Well, I'm an organizer by training. I came up as a community and a labor organizer. And, I'm a student of the civil rights movement and of many of the farm workers movement and many of the most successful struggles that have actually changed systems and policies that impact our material conditions. And so the book does lean towards interviewing leaders who continue that long tradition that you mentioned. Rosa Parks was a part of it, Ella Baker, Dolores
Mm,
Huerta, who's actually interviewed for the book, who co-founded the Farm Workers Union alongside Cesar Chavez. It does have a bent towards leaders who are using an organizing methodology. Organizing is basically the belief that our power doesn't come from money, our power comes from people, and
mm,
our ability to organize a grassroots base of ordinary people at scale for long enough to win systems change and to win the power to govern and to change the material conditions that are impacting our day-to-day lives. And so for me, the definition of winning is
mm,
having a grassroots base that has the power and the vibrancy and the sustainability to do that over time. Not just to win this next election or this next policy fight, but to sustain and win, fight after fight, hundreds of fights into the future, so that we actually have a mechanism by which to not only win ground, but hold that ground and then continue to win and again. Some people look at wins as just policy,
mm,
and I think policy is important, and it's an indication of how strong your organizing is to be able to get policy wins. Although we have to acknowledge that a policy win might be easier in Oakland, California than it is in Selma, Alabama, and it may
yeah.
take longer, and it requires more investment, and we need to be committed to that level of investment. But we also need to acknowledge that policy wins are paper thin if we don't have that grassroots base to defend them.
Mm,
And so that's why I say the base itself is fundamentally at the core of the win. So, for example, Roe v. Wade, a lot of people took for granted that that was the law of the land. And, you know, reproductive rights and justice movements were really left out in the cold for decades by a lot of other progressives, those in economic justice movements, those um, um, in the Democratic Party, treated that
mm,
issue like the electric third rail that they didn't want to touch for years.
yeah.
And you know what? When you don't continue to build a vibrant base and defend your wins, this is where we end up. And organizing has been severely eroded in this country. We've seen the decline of labor unions. We've seen the demise of Acorn. We've seen the incarceration and assassination of so many Black organizers who were really the backbone of many movements. And there is no workaround to rebuilding that, to having more people in our communities with the skill set to talk to ordinary folks, to love them, to not be self-righteous with them,
Yeah.
to meet people where they're at and listen deeply to what they care about and help them to gain the experience of using collective power with their neighbors, with their community members to experience a win that when they realize that light bulb goes off to understand that they actually have power, that light bulb was my favorite part of being a community organizer,
Mm,
because once that
mm.
goes off, it illuminates every aspect of people's life. And it's really, really hard once people know that they have power to convince them that they don't have it. And they're
Yes.
not willing to put up with as much shit. They feel entitled to more. And that is what helps with the engine of our fight. And so, um, rebuilding grassroots organizing infrastructure is something I'm really passionate about. And there are many women of color that have been in the lead of doing that. Um, and I'm super heartened and excited by their work.
This is very confusing, Vanessa. So a win is in I just go in and I tell you that you're stupid and you voted wrong and you're to blame for the
Yeah.
situation. What is this witchcraft that you teach? A win is lighting up the power in someone else.
Yes. Yes. And it is acknowledging that each and every one of us, where we are today is not where we were 10 or 20 years ago on our place in the learning curve. And I talk about this in the book about my own learning curve around, um, you know, fighting for trans justice and the mistakes that I've made around that. And having to scrape my knees and okay, I got to study more. I got to learn more of my history. I got to sit with my sisters, my trans sisters and siblings, and really understand about how to show up. So I think this devolution of many social justice spaces into some weird mix of Mean Girls and Lord of the Flies,
Mm,
where it's
mm.
like four liberal arts majors stunting on everyone online and they all agree with each other and they have no base whatsoever. I mean, my friend
Yeah.
Rinko Sin says, it's like building a coalition of these kind of formations. It's like nobody has a base that can
Mm.
affect any change. So it's like, well, 0 + 0 = 0. I
Yeah.
mean, this kind of approach to things where we have like lost the ability to discern the difference between, someone who is just well intentioned and on a different place in their learning curve, but truly trying,
Mm.
and who needs to be maybe challenged, maybe encouraged into some, rigor around how they show up, but brought along. Loretta Ross has a great book that just came out called Calling In that helps us
Yes.
with this. Um, like understanding the difference between that and then someone who is willfully being ignorant, like the racist
Mhm.
uncle who just is always going to sound off. And we need to draw some boundaries with that because we need to not make it okay for people to continue to harm folks in our spaces. We need to understand the difference between those things and stop treating them like they're the same. And we need to also understand what is the purpose of why we're in this work and remember where power comes from. Because I think there is a real kind of invasion of neoliberal, individualistic, narcissistic thinking into
Mhm.
movement
Mhm.
spaces where it really does become around not wokeness in a negative sense, because I think wokeness is brilliant. Wokeness means you're waking up to injustice and doing something about it. But performative wokeness is about actually just one-upping people. It's actually about increasing your own status by putting someone else down. And that is the value system of dominance. That is as Toni Morrison talks about with white folks, if you have to make someone else feel lower for you to feel higher, then something is deeply wrong with you. And we need to get that kind of thinking out of our movement spaces and that kind of action out of our movement spaces in all the ways that it shows up, whether we're dominating people, positioning ourselves because we're more woke than they are, or whether we are, using different identity, essentializing kind of categories to say, well, because I'm this, then my opinion about X is more correct than yours. As my colleague Maurice Mitchell says beautifully in his piece, Building Resilient Organizations, he says, I'm a Black man, but so is Clarence Thomas. So now where
Mhm.
are we? And as Linda Burnham, one of my movement elders, says, like, you can be a person of color and still as wrong as two left shoes. So we got to look at values, and we have to figure out how to ground in our values and show up together and bring each other along in a good way from a place of love, not from a place of fear and domination.
Yes. Oh, one of the things you're just highlighting in this moment here, too, that I truly love about being in community with other Black women is the ability
Mm.
to call one another in and hold one another accountable, right?
Yeah.
To say, your replay of punitive behaviors is not the liberal or the liberatory future that we are
Mm.
attempting to move toward.
Yeah.
You right? And I think that there is something, I know I learned it from my grandmother, or learned it from my mother, that ability to say, girl, that ain't it.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
see you on the path, but that ain't it.
Yeah.
And how do we bring more of that back into this space? As we wrap up today, because I really want to just talk to you for the next 24 hours, and they tell me that I'm not allowed to keep you because you're going from one place to another. You have you're at King's Books on Wednesday, March 26th at 7 p.m.
Yes,
at
in Tacoma.
Roma. Yeah.
Hmm.
What can people expect by coming out and being in that space together?
Yeah, so we've my book tour has is going to 10 cities.
Hmm.
I will say that we have sold out so far in Oakland, Brooklyn, Chicago, DC, and Seattle. So also Seattle folks, come on down to Tacoma. I know it's a little bit of a drive, but come on down to Tacoma. But these gatherings have really felt so fortifying. I
Hmm.
think people are feeling embattled right now. There's so much going on in our country, and there has been a real hunger to just be in community with each other. And so these environments have just felt warm, loving, a lot of reconnection, a lot of people seeing friends that they haven't seen for a long time, being able to be in these conversations that are hopeful about just the incredible wealth of resources that we have in our leadership and how we can access it. You know, it is really from an asset-based mindset instead of a deficit mindset. And so, yeah, I think people can expect a real deep dive conversation. I'll talk a little bit about the book, and then we will spend quite a bit of time in discussion and Q&A and really delving into how we can show up for each other and how we can meet this moment.
Hmm. Yeah, there's something, for those listeners, especially, if you're around Seattle, who have never been in a space where the center, the focus was on giving a woman of color the status in the room,
Hmm.
and to experience, I have not yet witnessed it, but even in this conversation with you, the way that you are both giving that status back as well, that exchange of power. For so many, they don't know what we're talking about when we say community.
Yeah.
They hear it as a word, but they have no felt sense. And so, just really encouraging people, go to King's Books, March 26th, 7 p.m., and feel what Vanessa is talking about in the book, Unrig the Game. Sometimes you have to understand it somatically, and
Yes.
then you read it so that you can apply it. Mm.
Yes.
Vanessa, will you close us today by saying, what is your one hope or wish or your charge to everyone as we leave this space?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't be a good organizer if I didn't have an organizing ask at the end that was grounded in hope. And that's really that people recognize and value the superpowers that so many women of color leaders are bringing to social change, and then intervene in what gets in their way. Don't be a bystander, intervene and disrupt it. And my hope is that these sisters will have a freer and more open runway from which to do their work, which in turn helps all of us win.
All of us win.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a delight.
Thank you, Vanessa Priya Daniel, author of Unrig the Game, What Women of Color Can Teach Everyone About Winning. Thank you for taking a time to be with us today.
Appreciate you. Be well.